The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of Lilycroft Hall with that particular quality of English autumn, soft, melancholic, and somehow accusatory. Miss Marple sat in the drawing-room, her knitting needles clicking with a rhythm as steady and reassuring as a grandfather clock, though her pale blue eyes were far from idle. She had arrived at the invitation of her distant cousin, Eleanor Ashford, who presided over the hall with the kind of authority that suggested she had been born wearing pearls and a perpetual expression of mild disapproval. The great house, perched on the gentle rise of a Cotswolds hill overlooking the village of Lilycroft below, seemed to exhale contentment, yet Miss Marple had long ago learned that contentment was often the most deceptive of all human emotions. Eleanor's birthday celebration had been planned with military precision. She was turning 75, an age she wore like a medal, and the occasion warranted a full assembly of the village's most prominent families. The drawing-room had been transformed into something approaching magnificence, with masses of white chrysanthemums arranged in tall crystal vases, and a long table laden with the kind of food one no longer saw in wartime Britain, even now that the war was years behind them. There was roasted pheasant, aged cheeses from the village dairy, and an improbable fruitcake that Mrs. Hutchins, Eleanor's cook, had been perfecting for a fortnight. A string quartet had been engaged from the city, and the drawing-room possessed an air of careful festivity that spoke of months of preparation. The guests had begun arriving at 3 o'clock that afternoon. There was Colonel Jasper Weatherby, a man of rigid military bearing who lived in the old rectory with his wife Margaret, a nervous sort of woman who seemed perpetually afraid she would commit some dreadful social gaffe. Their son, Peter, had come down from London for the occasion, though Miss Marple detected in his demeanour that particular tension of a young man who had never quite met his father's exacting standards. There was also Dr. Edmund Hale, the village physician, a widower of some years who had devoted himself to his practice and the maintenance of an increasingly neglected rose garden. His daughter, Catherine, had accompanied him, a beautiful young woman of perhaps 28, possessed of the kind of quiet intelligence that men often overlooked but women rarely did. James Ashford, Eleanor's son, had travelled from his home in Surrey with his wife, Patricia, a woman 15 years his junior, whose primary accomplishment seemed to be the acquisition of increasingly expensive jewellery. There was also Violet Ashford Pierce, Eleanor's niece, a widow whose late husband had left her comfortably provided for, but whose disposition had been permanently soured by grief, or so she claimed, though Miss Marple suspected something far more complex lurked beneath that carefully maintained facade of melancholy. The final guest of consequence was Mr. Gerald Finch, Eleanor's solicitor and oldest friend, a man of perhaps 70 who possessed that particular combination of shrewdness and affability that suggested a long career of extracting truth from human nature, though in his case through the medium of inheritance disputes and property entanglements rather than murder. He had known Eleanor since they were children together at village school, before she had married and climbed the social ladder rung through a judicious combination of intelligence and advantageous connections. Tea had been served at 4 o'clock, and the party had settled into that peculiar social rhythm that the English upper classes had perfected over centuries. Comfortable silences punctuated by remarks about the weather, observations about the rose garden's condition, and carefully modulated gossip about absent friends. Miss Marple had positioned herself in the corner of the room in an armchair that caught the afternoon light perfectly for her knitting, and from this vantage point she had observed the interactions of the assembled company with the attention of a woman who had spent 70 years watching the infinite variations of human behaviour in her own village of St. Mary Mead. What struck her, even as she bent over her knitting, was the undercurrent of tension that ran through the room like a subterranean stream. Eleanor sat at the centre of the gathering, receiving congratulations and good wishes with a graciousness that never quite reached her eyes. James and Patricia seemed to maintain a distance from one another that suggested a recent disagreement. Peter Weatherby watched Catherine Hale with an intensity that spoke of interests that went beyond mere social courtesy. Violet sat stiffly in a straight-backed chair, her knuckles white as she gripped her teacup, and the good doctor seemed to have exhausted his conversational resources within the first half hour. At precisely 5:30, Eleanor announced that she had a special treat for her guests. She had secured a particular vintage of champagne, a French wine from before the war that her late husband had laid down in the cellar decades ago, and she had decided that this birthday gathering was the appropriate occasion for its consumption. There was a murmur of appreciation. Eleanor rose from her seat with the ceremony of a woman who enjoyed making announcements, and she moved toward the door to summon Mrs. Hutchins to bring the champagne from the cellar where it had been kept in cool darkness for 20 years or more. But it was at this moment, precisely as Eleanor reached the threshold of the drawing-room, that one of the terrible accidents that punctuate polite life occurred. The great candelabra that hung from the ceiling, a massive Edwardian fixture of crystal and wrought iron that had presided over Lilycroft Hall's gatherings for nearly a century, suddenly, inexplicably, began to descend. Its supports, which had been adjusted that morning by the gardener for cleaning, had apparently not been properly resecured, and the weight of 20 candles in their holders was sufficient to overcome whatever negligent fastening had been employed. The candelabra fell, not slowly or with the mercy of a gradual descent, but with sudden catastrophic force. Eleanor Ashford stood directly beneath it. There was the sound of shattering crystal, the terrible thud of metal against yielding human flesh, and then Eleanor was lying on the carpet, the candelabra atop her, surrounded by fragments of crystal that caught the afternoon light like scattered stars. Mrs. Hutchins, ascending the stairs with the champagne in her hands, dropped the bottles with a crash that seemed to echo through the entire house. For a moment, the room existed in absolute silence, that suspension of time that occurs when the impossible has just become the visible reality. Then Catherine Hale moved. As the daughter of a physician, she had learned what to do in emergencies, and she knelt beside Eleanor with a presence of mind that would have been admirable under different circumstances. But even as she reached for Eleanor's wrist to search for a pulse, even as Dr. Hale rushed forward to attempt what his medical knowledge could accomplish, Miss Marple, still seated in her corner with her knitting needles suspended in mid-air, allowed her pale blue eyes to move across the faces of the assembled company. And in that moment, watching their reactions, the shock, yes, but also something else, something that flickered behind the eyes of more than one person present, she began, in that quiet way of hers, to wonder if what had just occurred was truly the accident that everyone else was accepting without question. The constable from Lilycroft below arrived within 30 minutes, a sensible man named Graves who had held the position for 12 years, and had learned, in that time, that most crimes in small villages were accidents, suicides, or crimes of passion committed by people who immediately confessed to them. Inspector Blackwood, a more senior officer from the county town, arrived an hour later, and it was he who would preside over the initial investigation. He was a man of perhaps 55, with the kind of methodical patience that suggested a career spent extracting truth from circumstances that would have defeated less persistent minds. He examined the candelabra first, then the ceiling from which it had fallen, and finally Eleanor Ashford herself, who lay in the library. The scene having been moved there to allow the drawing-room to remain accessible, though for what purpose was not entirely clear to anyone present, the medical examination was swift and conclusive. Eleanor Ashford was dead, had been dead within minutes of the candelabra's descent, though whether she had been conscious during those minutes was a matter of some uncertainty. The weight of the fixture, concentrated primarily on her head and shoulders, had caused injuries that were, in Dr. Hale's clinical terminology, incompatible with life. The initial verdict was accidental death, a tragic occurrence brought about by negligence in the securing of a heavy object. Inspector Blackwood made notes with the kind of thoroughness that suggested he believed in documentation, even when the conclusion seemed foregone, and he interviewed each guest in turn, asking them to account for their precise location when the candelabra had fallen. Colonel Weatherby had been standing near the window, examining the garden. Peter Weatherby had been in conversation with Catherine Hale near the fireplace. Patricia Ashford had been seated beside her husband, James, who was near the entrance to the room. Violet Ashford Pierce had been, as she stated repeatedly with a trembling voice, in the corner where she always sat, observing the proceedings with that air of detachment that grief had supposedly afforded her. Dr. Hale himself had been standing near the tea-table, and Mr. Finch, the solicitor, had been perusing the bookshelf, a habit he had apparently developed many years ago during previous visits to Lilycroft Hall. Mrs. Hutchins had been ascending the stairs with the champagne, and Miss Marple had been exactly where she always was, in her chair with her knitting, from which vantage point she had observed the entire proceedings with the attention of a woman who had very little else to occupy her time. It was at this point, as Inspector Blackwood was preparing to close his notebook and schedule the formal inquest, that something occurred which suggested the situation might warrant closer examination. The gardener, a taciturn man named Sutton, who had been questioned regarding the securing of the candelabra supports, admitted, when pressed, that he had not personally resecured them after the morning cleaning. He had, he said, adjusted the ropes and asked young Peter Weatherby to fasten them properly, as the boy had been passing through the hall at the time and seemed to have nothing better to occupy himself with. Peter, when questioned again, became somewhat defensive and claimed that he had indeed fastened them, though he could not precisely recall whether he had tested the security of his work. Inspector Blackwood's eyes narrowed slightly at this, though he made no comment. It was the first hint of negligence that could be as signed to a specific individual, and negligence, however unintentional, could occasionally shade into culpability if one examined the matter from certain angles. But it was Miss Marple, sitting quietly in the drawing-room as the inspection and questioning proceeded around her, who noticed something that had escaped everyone else's attention. She had risen from her chair at some point during the commotion, partly from curiosity, and partly from the practical necessity of moving aside when a medical emergency was occurring in one's immediate vicinity, and she had moved to examine the candelabra's supports more closely. The ropes by which it had hung were of a particular type of hemp that she recognized from her own house at St. Mary Mead, where a similar fixture had required periodic maintenance. The rope that should have been supporting the candelabra's weight had frayed, and frayed in a particular way that suggested something more deliberate than simple age and deterioration. She mentioned this observation to no one at the time, recognizing with the wisdom of her 70 years that such comments, when made by elderly ladies who had no official standing in matters of criminal investigation, were invariably dismissed as the fanciful observations of minds inclined towards seeing drama where none existed. Instead, she simply examined the rope more closely, noting that the fraying seemed to be concentrated in one specific area, as though something sharp had been applied to the rope repeatedly over a period of time, perhaps hours, perhaps days, gradually weakening the fiber until the weight of the candelabra became too much for its supports to bear. The funeral was scheduled for the following Saturday, and Lilycroft Hall fell into that particular state of quiet mourning that overtakes a great house when death has visited its inhabitants. The village, meanwhile, engaged in the key of gossip that such events naturally provoked. The consensus seemed to be that it was a tragedy, but an understandable one, a consequence of old age and the accumulated negligence of those responsible for the maintenance of great houses. There were suggestions that Eleanor had been something of a taskmaster, that she had perhaps expected too much of servants and hired workers, that her death might be viewed as a natural consequence of the tension she created around herself. No one, it seemed, had particularly liked Eleanor Ashford, though everyone spoke of her with the kind of respect that great age and considerable wealth commanded, even in death. Miss Marple remained at Lilycroft Hall at Eleanor's request, the request having been made in Eleanor's will, which Mr. Finch read to the assembled family on the morning after her death. Eleanor had asked, some years previously, that Miss Marple might be invited to stay at the Hall for a period of time following her death, ostensibly for purposes of companionship and to assist in matters of settling the estate. The family, surprised by this bequest of Eleanor's attention, had agreed that it would be appropriate to honor her wishes. And so Miss Marple found herself remaining in the great house as its temporary custodian, occupying a bedroom that looked out over the rose garden where Dr. Hale's professional eye would have found much to criticize, and where she could observe, at her leisure, the comings and goings of the village and its inhabitants. It was during the evening of the day following Eleanor's death that James Ashford approached her in the library, where she was sitting with her knitting. He was a man of perhaps 60, with the kind of face that suggested a life spent in avoiding confrontation rather than seeking it out. He looked, she thought, the way a man might look if he had discovered that a great burden he'd been carrying for years was suddenly about to become infinitely heavier. He asked if she might, in her capacity as someone close to Eleanor, be willing to provide advice regarding certain matters of a delicate nature. Miss Marple, who had long ago learned that delicate nature invariably meant something requiring careful discretion, set down her knitting and indicated that she was willing to listen. James Ashford took a seat across from her and proceeded to relate a story that suggested that Eleanor's death, whatever its immediate circumstances, had not been met with universal grief by all members of the family gathered at the hall. James Ashford began by explaining that his mother had been, in many respects, a woman of considerable complexity. She had been generous with her money, but exacting in her expectations. She had loved her family, or so he believed, though her manner of expressing that love had often seemed more like criticism than affection. The estate at Lilycroft Hall was worth, he estimated, somewhere in the vicinity of £200,000, a fortune of considerable magnitude, and the question of its disposition had occupied Eleanor's thoughts and conversations for the better part of the previous decade. She had made and remade her will repeatedly, according to Mr. Finch, each new version reflecting some new grievance or disappointment with one family member or another. The will that had been read that morning had been drafted only 6 months previously, which meant that it represented Eleanor's most recent assessment of who deserved her money and who did not. Under the terms of this final will, the bulk of the estate, some £150,000, had been left to James himself, with the explicit condition that he ensure Patricia receive no more than £10,000 as a personal bequest. This had been Eleanor's way of expressing her disapproval of his marriage, which she had always viewed as a union undertaken for mercenary reasons rather than affection. Violet had been left £20,000, with the stipulation that the income from the principal could only be accessed if she remained a widow and did not remarry. Peter Weatherby had been left £5,000, designated as an educational fund for any children he might eventually produce, though the fund could only be accessed by his offspring, not by Peter himself. Catherine Hale had received a modest £3,000, a bequest that had surprised everyone, as Eleanor's connection to the doctor's daughter had never been particularly warm or obvious. The servants and various charitable institutions had been provided for in smaller amounts, and the household furnishings and artwork were to be dispersed according to James's judgment. What this arrangement meant, James explained with considerable delicacy, was that he had suddenly become a very wealthy man, while his wife had been essentially cut off except for a pittance. Patricia had taken this news with a composure that James described as unsettling. She had said nothing immediately, but he had observed in her subsequent behavior a kind of brittle gaiety that suggested her mind was working behind that carefully maintained smile. He had also become aware, through the kind of accidental observation that husbands sometimes make, that Patricia had been seen in close conversation with Peter Weatherby on several occasions during the gathering at Lilycroft Hall, conversations that had ended abruptly when other people approached. Moreover, James had learned from one of the servants that Patricia had been asking questions about the maintenance of the candelabra, specifically about who was responsible for securing it after it had been cleaned. Miss Marple listened to this recitation with the kind of attention that suggested she was absorbing not only the content of what was being said, but the manner in which it was being communicated. James Ashford was a man troubled by suspicion, she observed, but not the kind of suspicion that came from having seen something concrete. Rather, it was the suspicion that arises when one's wife has suffered a sudden diminishment in financial prospects, and when one has observed her in behavior that could be innocent, but might not be. He was suggesting, without quite saying so directly, that he wondered if Patricia might have had something to do with Eleanor's death. Not from malice, perhaps, but from the kind of desperation that sudden impoverishment could create in a woman accustomed to luxury. Miss Marple asked James a series of seemingly innocent questions about his wife's activities during the tea party and the moments preceding Eleanor's death. James confirmed that Patricia had been with him, though he admitted that she had left his side for perhaps 15 minutes during the proceedings, claiming that she needed to refresh her appearance. When she had returned, she had seemed slightly flustered, though she had explained this by saying that she had encountered Mrs. Hutchins in the hallway and had been persuaded to taste some of the champagne that had been brought up from the cellar in preparation for the birthday toast. Miss Marple filed this information away in that portion of her mind that was devoted to the collection of seemingly unimportant details that occasionally proved to be of considerable significance. She then asked James whether his mother's recent will had been widely known among the family members. James admitted that Eleanor had mentioned it to him directly, wanting him to understand that his inheritance was conditional upon his maintaining good relations with his siblings and ensuring that the estate was preserved as a family seat rather than sold to strangers. Patricia had learned of the will's contents through James, of course, though Eleanor had taken the unusual step of informing Violet directly of her bequest, having wanted to ensure that her niece understood the stipulation regarding remarriage. Peter had not been informed of his £5,000 bequest, James thought, though Eleanor might have mentioned it to his father, the Colonel. The other members of the assembled party would not have been apprised of Eleanor's financial arrangements, as these were matters that she kept strictly private. Miss Marple then asked whether James had noticed anything unusual about the candelabra or its supports in the days preceding Eleanor's death. James looked somewhat startled by this question, as though it had touched upon something he had been thinking but had not wished to articulate. He admitted, somewhat reluctantly, that he had noticed the gardener, Sutton, examining the ropes from which the candelabra hung on the morning of the party. This had struck him as odd at the time, though he had assumed it was simply routine maintenance. More peculiar still had been an observation made by one of the housemaids, who had mentioned to the staff that she had seen someone, she could not quite determine who, in the drawing-room very early that morning, before the household was fully awake, apparently looking at the candelabra. When asked to describe this person more precisely, the maid had been unable to provide any useful details beyond the fact that it had been someone of medium height, dressed in a dressing gown. This information caused Miss Marple's knitting needles to pause for the briefest of moments. She resumed her work almost immediately, but her eyes had taken on that particular quality of intensity that suggested her mind was engaged in the kind of complex calculatio, and that appeared to occupy most of her conversational time. She asked James whether he had mentioned this detail to Inspector Blackwood during the official investigation. James admitted that he had not, as he had thought it might be nothing more than a servant attending to household duties, and he had not wished to cause unnecessary complications for the staff. Moreover, he had been somewhat preoccupied with the shock of his mother's death and the subsequent revelations about the will's disposition. Miss Marple observed that it seemed to her that the matter might warrant closer examination than it had thus far received, though she acknowledged that such observations from elderly ladies of no official capacity were rarely greeted with enthusiasm by those responsible for criminal matters. Nevertheless, she suggested that James might consider having a private conversation with Inspector Blackwood, not to make accusations but simply to ensure that all potentially relevant details had been brought to the officer's attention. She also asked somewhat casually whether James had noticed anything particular about his wife's demeanor following Eleanor's death. He admitted that she had seemed, if anything, more cheerful than she had been in months, which he found deeply troubling given the apparent callousness that such cheerfulness would suggest. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully and returned her attention to her knitting, leaving James to depart with the sense that he had been both comforted and unsettled by their conversation, a common state of mind for those who had just consulted with Miss Marple regarding matters of criminal significance. The day after her conversation with James Ashford, Miss Marple found herself in the position of being able to observe the household with a degree of intimacy that had not been available to her during Eleanor's lifetime. The great house, now, under the temporary supervision of James, and awaiting the formal transfer of control that would follow the reading of the will in its legal capacity, had fallen into a state of considerable disruption. The servants moved through their duties with the kind of distraction that came from knowing that their positions might change significantly depending on how the new master chose to manage the estate. Mrs. Hutchins, the cook, seemed particularly agitated, having apparently believed that Eleanor's death might somehow enhance her own position, only to discover that James seemed inclined to maintain the existing household arrangements, at least for the present time. It was during the morning following her conversation with James that Miss Marple encountered Patricia in the library. Patricia was seated at Eleanor's desk, which was an interesting choice, Miss Marple thought, as most people would have avoided such a location out of a sense of respect for the dead, or at least a concern that such an action might be perceived as presumptuous. Patricia was examining some papers with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was looking for something specific rather than engaging in idle curiosity. When she noticed Miss Marple's entrance, she looked up with a start that seemed genuine enough, though Miss Marple had long ago learned that startled reactions could be feigned by those possessed of sufficient motivation. Patricia explained that she had been attempting to locate certain household accounts as she wished to understand the financial state of the estate. This was a reasonable enough explanation, though it was also the kind of explanation that tended to be offered when one had been caught doing something that might appear suspicious if examined too closely. Miss Marple observed, in her gentle fashion, that financial matters were ordinarily James's province, particular. Lie now that Eleanor was deceased. Patricia responded, with a kind of brittle brightness, that she simply wished to understand the extent of her husband's newly acquired wealth, as wives generally appreciated such knowledge. Miss Marple accepted this explanation with a nod that suggested she found it plausible, while reserving judgment regarding its truthfulness. Over the course of the following days, Miss Marple engaged in a series of conversations with various members of the household and guests who remained at Lilycroft Hall. She spoke with Peter Weatherby, ostensibly about his plans for returning to London, but in reality gathering information about his relationship with Catherine Hale. Peter proved to be considerably more forthcoming than she had expected, admitting with the kind of candor that comes from youth and a belief in one's own social position that he and Catherine had been developing what he termed a particular attachment for some months. He had been hoping that Eleanor's birthday gathering would provide an opportunity for him to speak to Catherine's father about his intentions. Though Eleanor's sudden death had rendered such matters secondary to considerations of mourning and propriety, Miss Marple then sought out Catherine Hale herself and discovered her in the hall's substantial library, ostensibly selecting books to read, though in reality she seemed to be engaging in the kind of aimless activity that people undertake when their minds are occupied with matters of considerable personal significance. Catherine proved to be a young woman of considerable intelligence and a certain independence of thought that suggested she had not allowed her father's opinions to entirely shape her worldview. She confirmed that she and Peter had developed feelings for one another, though she expressed uncertainty about the wisdom of pursuing such a connection given the current circumstances. She also mentioned in passing that Eleanor had spoken to her privately during the birthday gathering, and had made certain remarks about Peter's character that Catherine had found both hurtful and somewhat mysterious, as Eleanor had seemed to be suggesting that Peter's interest in her was not entirely motivated by affection. This detail proved to be of considerable interest to Miss Marple, as it suggested that Eleanor had possessed information, or at least opinions, regarding Peter's motivations that went beyond what would ordinarily be available to casual observation. Miss Marple inquired, with her characteristic gentleness, whether Eleanor had elaborated on these observations. Catherine admitted that she had not pressed the matter, being distressed by Eleanor's implications and preferring not to engage in further discussion. However, she had gained the impression that Eleanor believed Peter's interest in her might be connected to financial considerations rather than genuine affection. This revelation struck Miss Marple as particularly significant, as it suggested that Eleanor had been aware of matters that the younger members of the household had believed to be private. Miss Marple subsequently arranged a conversation with Colonel Weatherby, who proved to be considerably less forthcoming than the younger members of the family. The colonel was a man of rigid principles and considerable pride, and he seemed to view Miss Marple's inquiries with a degree of suspicion that suggested he believed she was engaging in something approaching impertinence. However, Through a combination of flattery regarding his military service and gentle suggestions that his cooperation might ultimately prove beneficial to his son, Miss Marple managed to extract certain admissions. The Colonel acknowledged that his finances had been somewhat constrained in recent years, a situation that had caused him considerable frustration and shame. He had hoped that his son's connection with the Ashford family might provide certain financial advantages, though he had instructed Peter to pursue such a connection only if genuine affection was involved. It was at this point that the Colonel revealed a detail that caused Miss Marple's understanding of the situation to shift significantly. Eleanor had apparently spoken to him in private during the birthday gathering, expressing concerns about his financial situation and offering to assist him with certain debts that he had accumulated. The Colonel had initially refused this offer, being a man of pride who did not accept charity, but Eleanor had been insistent, suggesting that she intended to speak to James about the matter and ensure that the family's financial resources were deployed in a manner that benefited all its members. The Colonel had gathered the impression that Eleanor was considering modifying her will to provide financial assistance to him, an action that would have been welcomed as a resolution to his difficulties. This revelation opened new avenues of inquiry in Miss Marple's mind. Eleanor had apparently been considering significant changes to her will in the days immediately preceding her death, changes that would have benefited the Colonel and potentially altered the financial landscape that had been established by her most recent will. This suggested that Eleanor's death might have prevented the implementation of provisions that could have substantially affected the inheritance arrangements that had been finalized when her will was read. Miss Marple filed this information away, recognizing that it introduced a new dimension to the question of who might have benefited from Eleanor's death and under what circumstances. She spent the remainder of that day in quiet reflection, sitting, the library with her knitting, allowing her mind to process the various details she had gathered. The picture that was beginning to emerge from these conversations was considerably more complex than the simple narrative of accidental death that Inspector Blackwood had been inclined to accept. Someone at Lilycroft Hall had possessed both motive and opportunity to ensure that the candelabra fell at precisely the moment that Eleanor stood beneath it. The question that remained to be answered was which person, among those with motive, had possessed sufficient knowledge of the candelabra's supports to weaken them in a manner that would ensure Eleanor's death while maintaining the appearance of accident. The formal funeral service took place on Saturday in the village church, a grey stone structure that had witnessed the baptisms, marriages and burials of Lilycroft's inhabitants for more than 4 centuries. The entire village seemed to have turned out for the occasion as Eleanor Ashford had been, despite her formidable nature, a significant figure in the community's social hierarchy. The service was conducted with the kind of ceremonial dignity that befitted a woman of her station, and the vicar delivered a eulogy that managed to be respectful without being dishonest, a considerable feat given that few people genuinely mourned Eleanor's passing. The flowers that surrounded her coffin were magnificent, though Miss Marple noted with quiet amusement that most of them had been ordered by the family, rather than donated by grieving friends or grateful beneficiaries of Eleanor's charitable works, which had been considerable in scale but limited in warmth. It was following the committal at the graveyard that Miss Marple had an unexpected encounter with Dr. Hale. The doctor had remained at the service long after most of the other mourners had departed, standing alone before Elia. Nor's grave with an expression that suggested he was engaged in contemplation of a matter of considerable personal significance. When Miss Marple approached him with an offer of sympathy regarding the loss of a long-standing acquaintance, Dr. Hale seemed to welcome the conversation, as though he had been hoping for an opportunity to discuss matters that had been troubling him. They walked together along the graveyard path, moving among the ancient tombstones with the kind of unhurried pace that seemed appropriate to both the location and the doctor's evident preoccupation. Dr. Hale began by explaining that he had been Eleanor's physician for more than 30 years, and that over the course of that extended professional relationship he had become aware of certain aspects of her personality and circumstances that were not generally known to the wider community. Eleanor had suffered from periods of considerable emotional disturbance, he explained, particularly in recent years as she had approached old age and confronted her own mortality. These periods had sometimes been accompanied by what he termed obsessive ideation, a tendency for Eleanor's mind to become fixed upon particular grievances or suspicions regarding the behavior of family members and servants alike. He had prescribed certain remedies for these conditions, though Eleanor had not always been consistent in taking them, having possessed that particular stubbornness that often characterized forceful personalities. More significantly, Dr. Hale revealed that Eleanor had consulted with him privately on several occasions during the weeks immediately preceding her death. She had expressed concerns about certain members of her household, concerns that had seemed to the doctor to be somewhat disproportionate to the actual evidence that Eleanor could provide. She had suspected, she claimed, that there was a plot AFO, OT to manipulate her into changing her will in ways that would benefit certain family members at the expense of others. She had believed that Peter Weatherby was being encouraged to court Catherine Hale, specifically because Eleanor was known to favor the doctor's daughter, and that the entire scheme was designed to create a situation in which Eleanor would feel obligated to provide financial assistance to the Weatherby family through an enhanced bequest to Peter. She had also expressed suspicion that Patricia Ashford had become involved in some kind of inappropriate relationship with a younger man. Dr. Hale believed he had heard Eleanor mention Peter's name in this context, though he could not be entirely certain. Miss Marple listened to this recitation with her characteristic attention, her mind filing away the details as they were presented. She asked Dr. Hale whether he had shared these concerns with anyone else, or whether he had mentioned them to Eleanor's son and family. The doctor admitted that he had not, believing such disclosures to be bound by the confidentiality that his professional position implied. He had, however, suggested to Eleanor that she might benefit from a period of rest and a reduction in her daily anxieties, advice that Eleanor had largely ignored. The doctor seemed troubled by the possibility that Eleanor's death might somehow be connected to the psychological stress that had been afflicting her in recent months, as though he felt a degree of professional responsibility for the outcome. It was at this point that Miss Marple asked a question that caused Dr. Hale to stop walking and turn to face her with considerable surprise. She inquired whether Eleanor had specifically mentioned to him that she intended to alter her will in the days preceding her death. The doctor confirmed that she had indeed made such a reference, expressing her intention to speak with Mr. Finch about various modifications. She had seemed, he said, determined to rectify what she perceived as injustices in her existing arrangements, though she had not elaborated on the specific nature of these modifications. Miss Marple then asked whether Eleanor had seemed afraid of anyone in particular, or whether she had expressed concerns about her personal safety. Dr. Hale hesitated before answering this question, clearly uncertain whether medical confidentiality should prevent him from providing such information. Finally, he admitted that Eleanor had mentioned, almost in passing, that she sometimes felt as though someone in the household was watching her, observing her movements and her activities. She had not expressed specific fear of physical harm, but rather a kind of general unease regarding the intentions and attention of those around her. Following her conversation with Dr. Hale, Miss Marple returned to Lilycroft Hall with her mind working through the various pieces of information she had gathered. Eleanor's behavior in the weeks preceding her death suggested that she had been engaged in contemplation of significant changes to her will, changes that might have substantially altered the financial advantages that had accrued to various family members under the terms of the will that had been read after her death. The fact that Eleanor had mentioned specific suspicions regarding Peter Weatherby and Patricia Ashford suggested that she had been considering modifications that would either enhance or reduce the benefits these individuals received. The psychological disturbance that Dr. Hale had described suggested that Eleanor's mind might have been somewhat unstable in her final weeks, though whether this instability had been genuine or whether it was a cover for genuine concerns remained to be determined. That evening, Miss Marple found herself seated in the drawing-room with Mr. Finch, the solicitor, who had remained at Lilycroft Hall to attend to various legal matters related to Eleanor's estate. She engaged him in conversation regarding the nature of Eleanor's final will and whether Eleanor had indicated any intention to modify it further. Mr. Finch, bound by certain confidentiality restrictions, but also inclined to be forthcoming with Miss Marple, given her obvious concern for proper resolution of matters, admitted that Eleanor had indeed telephoned him on the morning of her birthday, expressing her intention to discuss significant modifications to her will. She had asked whether he might be available to see her that evening or the following day to discuss these changes. He had agreed to make himself available on the following day, an appointment that Eleanor would never keep. When pressed gently by Miss Marple regarding the nature of these proposed modifications, Mr. Finch admitted that Eleanor had not provided details over the telephone, but had given the impression that the changes would be substantial and would involve redirection of funds from some family members to others. This revelation suggested that Eleanor's death had occurred at precisely the moment when the disposition of her considerable fortune was about to be fundamentally altered, a fact that introduced a new and more sinister dimension to the question of whether her death had truly been accidental. The week following Eleanor's funeral was characterized by a peculiar tension that seemed to settle over Lilycroft Hall like an unwelcome guest. The household staff moved through their duties with a kind of mechanical efficiency that suggested their minds were occupied with matters considerably more significant than the polishing of silver or the arrangement of flowers. James Ashford had assumed his position as master of the house with a gracio, usness that seemed to cost him considerable effort, and he had made it clear that all members of the family were welcome to remain as his guests for as long as they required. This generosity of spirit, while admirable on the surface, seemed to mask an underlying tension regarding the implications of Eleanor's death and the sudden alteration in financial circumstances that it had produced. It was during this period that Miss Marple began to engage in a series of apparently casual observations regarding the movements and activities of the various household members. She had noticed, for instance, that Patricia had taken to spending considerable time in the library examining household accounts and correspondence, a pursuit that James seemed to tolerate with a patience that suggested either genuine indifference or a deliberate decision not to interrogate his wife regarding her activities. More significantly, Miss Marple had observed that Patricia and Peter had engaged in several private conversations that seemed to end abruptly when other members of the household approached. On one occasion, Miss Marple had been passing through the corridor that led to the morning room and had distinctly heard Patricia's voice saying, "We must be careful. Everything depends on the outcome of the investigation," before the speakers fell silent upon hearing her footsteps. This fragment of conversation caused Miss Marple considerable reflection. The phrase, "the outcome of the investigation," suggested that Patricia and Peter were discussing matters related to Eleanor's death and its official investigation, rather than simply conducting routine family conversations. The implication that their future plans depended upon this outcome was even more intriguing, suggesting that Patricia and Peter might share a common interest in ensuring that Eleanor's death remained classified as ACC, idental, rather than anything more sinister. This raised the question of whether Patricia and Peter might be allied in some scheme that had resulted in Eleanor's death, or whether they were simply concerned about matters that might be revealed during a more thorough investigation. Miss Marple subsequently arranged to speak with Violet Ashford Pierce, who had remained at Lilycroft Hall in a state of what appeared to be profound grief, tempered with occasional moments of a brittle gaiety that seemed entirely at odds with her emotional state. Violet, when approached by Miss Marple, seemed initially reluctant to engage in conversation, but gradually warmed to the older woman's patient and gentle inquiry. Violet eventually admitted that she had been experiencing considerable anxiety regarding the implications of Eleanor's death. She explained that her late husband had left her comfortably provided for, but that her financial situation was precarious enough that the £10,000 bequest from Eleanor's will represented a significant addition to her annual income. The stipulation that she could only access this income if she remained a widow was, she claimed, of little consequence, as she had no intention of remarrying. However, the death itself had raised certain questions in her mind regarding the circumstances under which it had occurred. Violet then revealed that she had observed something during the birthday gathering that she had not mentioned to Inspector Blackwood, partly because she had thought it insignificant at the time, and partly because she had been reluctant to accuse anyone of questionable behavior without more substantial evidence. She had noticed that Sutton, the gardener, had seemed to be in communication with someone else in the household. Someone who appeared to be giving him instructions regarding the maintenance of the candelabra. She had seen them. In conversation in the hallway the morning before the party, a conversation that had ended when they noticed they were being observed. She had not been able to determine who the other person was, as they had turned away from her too quickly for her to see their face clearly, though she had the impression that it was someone of medium height and build, a description that could have applied to either Patricia or Catherine, and possibly to one or two of the female servants. This information struck Miss Marple as potentially significant, as it suggested that the arrangement of the candelabra's supports might not have been left entirely to chance or to the negligence of those responsible for household maintenance. If Sutton had been receiving instructions from someone else regarding the candelabra, this implied a deliberate plan rather than simple accident. Miss Marple inquired gently whether Violet had observed any other unusual activities or interactions during the days preceding Eleanor's death. Violet admitted that she had noticed Patricia examining the drawing room on the morning of the party, apparently looking at the candelabra specifically. She had also observed Peter climbing the main staircase early that same morning, carrying what appeared to be some kind of tool, though she had not seen him descend with it. These observations suggested that multiple people might have had access to the candelabra and the opportunity to weaken its supports, though whether they had acted separately or in concert remained unclear. Miss Marple then engaged in a private conversation with Sutton, the gardener, requesting his assistance in understanding the technical details of the candelabra's maintenance and installation. Sutton proved to be a man of limited education but considerable practical knowledge regarding the mechanical aspects of hanging fixtures and their supports. He explained, with a degree of reluctance that suggested he felt himself to be under suspicion, that he had been asked by Peter Weatherby to assist in securing the candelabra's ropes following the morning cleaning. However, he admitted that Peter had seemed to be giving him specific instructions regarding how the ropes should be fastened, instructions that seemed odd to him at the time because they involved a particular method of tying that left the ropes vulnerable to fraying if they were subjected to stress. When Miss Marple asked whether Peter had suggested this method of fastening, or whether Sutton had developed it himself, the gardener admitted that it had been Peter's explicit instruction. Upon further reflection and questioning, Sutton revealed that Peter had also asked him to return to the drawing room later in the day to check on the security of the fastening, with instructions to report back on whether the ropes seemed secure or whether they appeared to be coming loose. This detail suggested that Peter had been monitoring the status of the candelabra throughout the day, possibly ensuring that it would fall at a specific moment. When Miss Marple asked whether Peter had seemed surprised or distressed when the candelabra had indeed fallen, Sutton admitted that Peter had seemed, if anything, relieved, a reaction that seemed distinctly odd for someone who had just witnessed a tragedy. These revelations placed Miss Marple in a position of considerable uncertainty regarding the proper course of action. She had gathered sufficient information to suggest that Eleanor's death had not been accidental, but rather the result of a deliberate plan involving at least Peter Weatherby and possibly others. However, she lacked the kind of concrete evidence that would satisfy Inspector Blackwood's requirement for physical proof before he would reopen the investigation. She therefore resolved to engage in one final series of observations and conversations designed to determine not only who had been responsible for Eleanor's death, but more importantly, what had motivated them to undertake such a drastic action. The answer to this second question, she suspected, lay not in the inheritance arrangements that Eleanor's will had established, but rather in the changes that Eleanor had been planning to make to those arrangements in the days immediately preceding her death. It was on a grey afternoon, 5 days following Eleanor's funeral, that Miss Marple requested a private meeting with Catherine Hale in the library of Lilycroft Hall. Catherine arrived with a degree of apprehension evident in her expression, as though she suspected that Miss Marple had discovered something of considerable significance and intended to confront her with it. Miss Marple greeted her with her characteristic gentleness and offered her tea, which the younger woman accepted with obvious uncertainty. They sat in the comfortable chairs near the fireplace, and for several moments neither spoke, allowing the silence to establish itself as a kind of medium through which understanding might develop. Finally, Miss Marple began by asking Catherine to recount her activities during the morning of Eleanor's birthday party, paying particular attention to any interactions she might have had with Peter Weatherby. Catherine's response was guarded at first, but gradually became more candid as Miss Marple's evident understanding of the situation seemed to create a safe space for honesty. Catherine admitted that Peter had approached her early in the morning, before the other members of the household were fully awake, and had asked her to meet him in the drawing room. She had gone there, expecting that he intended to discuss their relationship or perhaps to ask her father for permission to court her. Formally. Instead, Peter had shown her something that had profoundly disturbed her, a document that appeared to be a draft of a new will that Eleanor had been preparing. Catherine explained that Peter had somehow obtained access to Eleanor's correspondence and had discovered a letter from Mr. Finch to Eleanor, in which the solicitor had outlined the provisions of a new will that Eleanor was proposing to draft. According to this letter, Eleanor intended to substantially reduce Peter's bequest from £5,000 to nothing at all, having apparently decided that Peter's character did not warrant even this modest provision. More significantly, Eleanor was proposing to enhance Catherine's own bequest from £3,000 to £20,000, while simultaneously reducing the amount left to James and increasing the provision for Violet. The letter also suggested that Eleanor was planning to provide financial assistance to Colonel Weatherby for the express purpose of alleviating his debt difficulties, money that would come from James's portion of the estate. Peter had apparently interpreted these proposed changes as a direct threat to his financial future, and, more immediately, to his prospects for marriage to Catherine. He had shown Catherine the letter and explained to her that he believed Eleanor was attempting to manipulate Catherine through financial incentive, rewarding her for maintaining emotional distance from Peter while simultaneously punishing Peter for his perceived inadequacy. Peter had claimed that Eleanor was deliberately creating a situation designed to prevent him from marrying Catherine by rendering him financially undesirable as a potential husband. He had asked Catherine whether she would be willing to help him prevent Eleanor from implementing these changes, though he had not at that point explained precisely what assistance he required. Cather. Rhine admitted that she had been confused and distressed by Peter's revelations and his request. She had not initially understood what he was proposing, but when Peter had suggested that they might be able to prevent the changes to Eleanor's will by ensuring that Eleanor did not survive long enough to formally execute these modifications, the true nature of his plan had become apparent to her. At this point, Catherine had become deeply frightened and had refused to participate in whatever scheme Peter was proposing. She had told him that she wanted nothing to do with his plans, and that she would not help him harm Eleanor under any circumstances. Peter had responded, according to Catherine, with considerable anger, suggesting that Catherine's refusal to assist him was evidence of her lack of genuine affection for him. He had then suggested that Catherine's father might be interested to hear about Eleanor's proposed financial arrangements, as the doctor stood to benefit from the enhanced bequest to his daughter. Miss Marple listened to this account with her characteristic attention, asking occasional questions designed to clarify specific details or to understand Catherine's emotional state during these revelations. She then asked whether Catherine had considered informing someone else of Peter's intentions, her father, for instance, or even Inspector Blackwood. Catherine admitted that she had not, partly because she had hoped that Peter's threats and implications were not genuine, and partly because she had been afraid that accusing Peter might result in serious legal consequences for him. She had simply tried to avoid him and to hope that the matter would resolve itself without requiring her active participation. Miss Marple then revealed that she had gathered sufficient evidence to suggest that Peter had indeed acted on his intentions, with or without the assistance of others. She explained that Sutton had confirmed Peter's involvement in the arrangement of the candelabra's supports, and that the manner in which the ropes had been secured seemed inconsistent with anything that Sutton would have developed on his own initiative. She suggested that Peter had likely weakened the candelabra's supports deliberately, knowing that Eleanor would be positioned directly beneath it when the champagne was being brought from the cellar. Catherine seemed to take this revelation as confirmation of her worst fears, and she began to weep quietly, apparently experiencing the full weight of the realization that her rejection of Peter's request might have contributed to Eleanor's death. Miss Marple then posed a crucial question to Catherine. She asked whether Peter had acted entirely alone in his scheme, or whether others had been involved. Catherine hesitated at this question, and Miss Marple sensed that she was wrestling with conflicting emotions regarding loyalty to Peter and responsibility for truth. Finally, Catherine admitted that she had overheard a conversation between Peter and Patricia Ashford in the corridor outside her bedroom on the night before Eleanor's death. They had been discussing the modifications to Eleanor's will that Peter had discovered, and Patricia had seemed surprisingly knowledgeable regarding Eleanor's intentions. Patricia had expressed concern that Eleanor's proposed modifications would leave her with insufficient financial resources, and she had asked Peter whether his plan to prevent Eleanor from implementing these changes would also benefit her financially. Peter had apparently assured her that it would, and they seemed to have reached some kind of understanding regarding their shared interest in ensuring that Eleanor's death occurred before she could finalize her new will. This revelation established that Patricia and Peter had been acting in concert, motivated by a shared interest in preventing Eleanor's financial reorganization from taking effect. Their alliance suggested that they had recognized, independently or through conversation, that Eleanor's proposed changes would disadvantage them both, and that they had therefore collaborated to ensure that Eleanor did not survive long enough to execute these modifications. Miss Marple then asked Catherine whether she possessed any evidence that might substantiate these conclusions, perhaps something she had witnessed, or some communication between Patricia and Peter that might serve as documentation of their conspiracy. Catherine admitted that she did not have such evidence, though she recalled that Patricia had asked her specifically about Eleanor's movements during the birthday gathering, seemingly trying to establish whether Eleanor would be in the drawing room at a particular time. Miss Marple recognized this as potentially significant, as it suggested that Patricia had been coordinating the timing of the candelabra fall with Eleanor's movements through the house. Following her conversation with Catherine Hale, Miss Marple spent the remainder of that afternoon engaged in what appeared to be idle reflection, seated in the library with her knitting needles working in their characteristic rhythm. However, her mind was far from idle. She was constructing a careful plan designed to extract a confession from the guilty parties without resorting to direct accusation, a methodology that had served her well throughout her years of dealing with criminal matters. She recognized that she lacked the kind of concrete physical evidence that would satisfy a court of law, but she possessed something equally valuable, a comprehensive understanding of human psychology and a talent for arranging circumstances in such a way that guilty parties would reveal themselves through their own actions and reactions. That evening, she requested a private meeting with Peter Weatherby in the study, citing as her reason a desire to discuss his future plans and his intentions regarding Catherine Hale. Peter arrived with a degree of casual confidence that suggested he believed himself to have successfully escaped suspicion regarding Eleanor's death. Miss Marple greeted him warmly and offered him a glass of sherry, which he accepted with the kind of ease that comes from a lifetime of moving through social situations without significant self-doubt. They engaged in preliminary conversation regarding his employment prospects in London and his family's circumstances, allowing Miss Marple to establish a rapport that would make her subsequent observations seem less accusatory than they might otherwise appear. Then Miss Marple shifted the direction of the conversation with the kind of seeming casualness that masked considerable deliberation. She mentioned that she had been speaking with Catherine regarding Eleanor's proposed modifications to her will, and that Catherine had explained to her the particular circumstances that had motivated Peter's concern regarding Eleanor's financial arrangements. Peter's response to this statement was immediate and visceral. His face paled noticeably, and his hand, which had been holding the sherry glass, developed a tremor that caused the liquid to slosh slightly. He attempted to recover his composure, suggesting that Catherine had misunderstood Eleanor's intentions or that Miss Marple had misinterpreted Catherine's explanation. Miss Marple responded gently that she believed she had understood quite clearly, and that she was not making accusations but simply seeking to understand the circumstances that had led to Eleanor's death. At this point, Peter attempted to leave the conversation, but Miss Marple's next observation caused him to pause. She mentioned, in a tone that suggested she was simply making conversation, that she had been examining the drawing room and had noticed that the rope from which the candelabra hung had been frayed in a manner that suggested deliberate intervention rather than simple age and deterioration. She further observed that such fraying would have required considerable time and effort, suggesting that whoever had undertaken such work would have needed access to the drawing room on multiple occasions during the days preceding Eleanor's death. She noted that Peter had been in the drawing room on several occasions, including very early on the morning of the birthday party, and that he had been observed by servants to be carrying something that might have been a sharp implement of some kind. Peter's response to these observations was to attempt a more vigorous denial, claiming that he had done nothing of the sort and suggesting that Miss Marple was engaging in the kind of wild speculation that elderly people sometimes indulged in when their minds had begun to deteriorate. This response, while defensive, was insufficient to entirely conceal the panic that was beginning to manifest in his behavior. Miss Marple then played what she calculated to be her crucial card. She mentioned that Sutton had provided a detailed account of Peter's instructions regarding the fastening of the candelabra's ropes, and that these instructions seemed inconsistent with standard practice for securing such fixtures. She suggested that Peter's knowledge of these technical details seemed remarkably precise for someone without professional experience in such matters, and that this precision suggested prior planning and deliberation. It was at this moment that Peter's composure fractured entirely. He rose from his chair with considerable agitation and began to pace the study, his hands clenched into fists. He did not precisely confess to his actions, but his subsequent words made clear that he was abandoning any pretense of innocence. He explained, in a tone that mingled desperation with justification, that Eleanor had been an intolerable woman who had used her money as a weapon to control and manipulate those around her. She had deliberately attempted to prevent him from marrying Catherine by rendering him financially inadequate, and she had done this out of a kind of malicious spite that seemed to have no basis in legitimate concern regarding his character. He claimed that he had only intended to warn Eleanor, to suggest to her through the arrangement of the candelabra that her actions had consequences, and that he had not truly expected her to die. The candelabra's fall had been an accident, he insisted, though his actions in weakening its supports had certainly created the condition under which such an accident became possible. Miss Marple listened to this confession with her characteristic composed attention, asking occasional clarifying questions designed to establish the precise nature of Peter's planning and the extent of Patricia's involvement. Peter, in his emotional state, seemed inclined to be forthcoming, perhaps experiencing a degree of relief at finally being able to articulate what had occurred. He admitted that Patricia had approached him following the reading of Eleanor's will, expressing her anger at the modest bequest she had received in comparison to what she had anticipated. She had told him about Eleanor's conversation with her regarding the proposed modifications to the will, and they had recognized a shared interest in preventing these modifications from being implemented. Patricia had provided him with the information regarding Eleanor's access to the drawing room and her likely movements during the birthday party, information that had allowed him to calculate when Eleanor would be positioned directly beneath the candelabra. Peter claimed that Patricia had not known the specific nature of his plan, but had understood that he was proposing to take some kind of action that would prevent Eleanor from finalizing her new will. She had asked him not to involve her in the details, apparently preferring to maintain plausible deniability regarding the actual mechanics of whatever he was proposing. Peter had then explained his plan to Sutton, having calculated that the gardener's cooperation would be essential if he was to gain access to the candelabra's supports and arrange them in a manner that would weaken their security. He had promised Sutton a financial incentive for his assistance, money that he had calculated he would wreck. Once Catherine's enhanced bequest became effective following Eleanor's death, it was at this point that Miss Marple made a crucial observation. She mentioned that the candelabra's fall had seemed, to her experienced eye, to be less a matter of pure accident than of deliberate engineering. Peter's previous description of his intent suggested that he had hoped merely to frighten Eleanor, but the manner in which the supports had been arranged seemed to suggest something more deliberately fatal. She asked Peter whether his plan had in fact involved ensuring Eleanor's death, or whether he had merely been engaging in wishful thinking regarding how Eleanor might respond to being terrorized by an object falling near her. Peter's response to this question came slowly and with considerable reluctance. He finally admitted that yes, his plan had been designed to ensure Eleanor's death, though he had attempted to frame it to himself as merely creating the conditions under which an accident might occur. He had known that a candelabra of such weight falling from such a height would almost certainly prove fatal if it struck someone directly, and he had positioned it with that knowledge clearly in mind. He had not intended for it to appear as accident through any attempt at deception, but rather he had hoped that it would appear as accident because no one would suspect him of having the knowledge or capability to arrange such a thing. The confession of Peter Weatherby raised immediate questions regarding the extent of Patricia Ashford's knowledge and complicity in the crime. Miss Marple recognized that while Peter had claimed Patricia was unaware of the specific details of his plan, her provision of information regarding Eleanor's movements and her clear understanding of the motivations behind preventing Eleanor's will modifications suggested a degree of intentional collaboration. That went considerably beyond mere inadvertent assistance. She therefore arranged a private meeting with Patricia, requesting her presence in the morning room on the pretext of discussing certain household matters that required the attention of the mistress of the house during James's absence on business in the village. Patricia arrived at this meeting with an appearance of casual indifference that seemed calculated to mask considerable underlying anxiety. She was dressed in an elegant afternoon gown of pale blue, a color choice that suggested she was attempting to project an image of innocence and composure, though her hands betrayed her by fidgeting with the fabric of her skirt in a manner that indicated considerable nervous tension. Miss Marple greeted her with warmth and offered her refreshment, which Patricia declined, apparently preferring to conclude their business with as much expedition as possible. Miss Marple then began by mentioning that she had been speaking with various members of the household regarding their recollections of the events surrounding Eleanor's death, and that she had gathered a considerable amount of information that seemed to suggest the accident had been rather less accidental than the official investigation had concluded. Patricia's response to this opening observation was to deny any knowledge of matters beyond what the official investigation had already established. She suggested that Miss Marple was allowing her imagination to construct elaborate theories from simple coincidences, and that such flights of fancy were perhaps inevitable when one spent a great deal of time in isolation and reflection. This attempted dismissal seemed designed to terminate the conversation before Miss Marple could present specific evidence, but Miss Marple proceeded undeterred. She mentioned that she had learned from various sources that Patricia had been inquiring about Eleanor's movements during the birthday party, specifically asking whether Eleanor would be in the drawing room at particular times. She further noted that Patricia had engaged in several private conversations with Peter Weatherby that had terminated abruptly when others approached, conversations that seemed to involve discussion of Eleanor's proposed modifications to her will. At this point, Patricia's composure began to deteriorate. She rose from her chair with a degree of agitation and began to assert that whatever conversations she might have had with Peter Weatherby were entirely innocent in nature and had no connection whatsoever to Eleanor's death. She suggested that Miss Marple was engaged in a kind of malicious gossip designed to cast suspicion upon innocent people, and that she resented being subjected to such insinuation. However, even as she made these protestations, her voice betrayed her through its trembling and the occasional catch that suggested she was struggling to maintain emotional control. Miss Marple observed, with the gentleness of manner that characterized her approach to such matters, that she was not attempting to accuse Patricia of anything, but simply to understand the circumstances that had led to Eleanor's death, and the roles that various household members had played in these circumstances. Miss Marple then revealed a crucial detail that she had previously withheld from Patricia. She mentioned that Peter Weatherby had provided a detailed account of his activities regarding the arrangement of the candelabra's supports, and that in the course of this account he had specifically acknowledged Patricia's role in providing him with information regarding Eleanor's likely position in the drawing room at the time of the accident. Moreover, Peter had made clear that Patricia had understood the general nature of his intentions, even if she had avoided learning the specific mechanics through which he planned to implement them. Patricia's response to this revelation was to claim that Peter was lying, that he was attempting to deflect responsibility from himself by implicating her in his schemes, and that she would deny his allegations absolutely if brought before any official inquiry. However, even as Patricia made these denials, Miss Marple observed a subtle shift in her demeanor that suggested the younger woman was recognizing the futility of continued denial. Miss Marple then posed a question that seemed designed to provide Patricia with an opportunity to explain her actions in a manner that might be perceived as less culpable than deliberate conspiracy. She asked whether Patricia had genuinely believed that Peter's plan would simply frighten Eleanor into abandoning her proposed modifications to her will, or whether she had understood from the beginning that Peter intended Eleanor's death. This question seemed to touch upon something within Patricia that the younger woman had perhaps been avoiding confronting, and her response came slowly and with evident reluctance. Patricia eventually admitted that she had suspected Peter's intentions were more serious than he had explicitly stated, though she had deliberately avoided asking him to clarify precisely what he was proposing. She had known that Eleanor intended to substantially reduce the financial provision that had been made for her in the will, leaving her in a precarious financial position that would effectively render her dependent upon James's goodwill regarding her access to household resources and personal income. She had also known that Eleanor had been planning to increase Catherine Hale's bequest significantly, an action that Patricia had interpreted as Eleanor's attempt to prevent Peter from marrying Catherine by rendering him financially inadequate in comparison to what the doctor's daughter would inherit. Patricia had recognized that Eleanor's planned modifications represented a kind of financial castigation, aimed at preventing a union between Catherine and Peter, and she had resented this interference in matters that she believed should be left to the young people involved to determine for themselves. When Peter had approached her with hints regarding his plans, Patricia had recognized an opportunity to protect her own financial interests while simultaneously addressing what she perceived as Eleanor's unfair attempt to control the younger generation's choices. She had provided Peter with information regarding Eleanor's movements and her likely position in the drawing room, information that she had gathered through careful observation and through her position as a member of the household with access to Eleanor's schedule and habits. She had not asked Peter to explain precisely how he intended to use this information, preferring to maintain a degree of plausible deniability regarding the specific nature of his plan. However, she admitted that she had suspected Eleanor would be harmed, and that she had consciously chosen not to investigate Peter's intentions more closely because she feared that direct knowledge of his plan would make her complicit in a manner that she could not ethically deny. This admission represented a kind of confession, though one couched in language that suggested Patricia was attempting to minimize her moral and legal culpability. She had not actively participated in the arrangement of the candelabra supports, but she had provided the information that had made the crime possible, and she had done so with a reasonable understanding that Eleanor's death was likely to result from Peter's actions. Miss Marple observed that such distinctions between active and passive participation in crime were often meaningless in the eyes of the law, and that Patricia would likely face serious legal consequences for her role in the conspiracy, regardless of the degree to which she had attempted to distance herself from the specific mechanics of the crime. Inspector Blackwood arrived at Lilycroft Hall on the following morning, summoned by a telegram that Miss Marple had dispatched the previous evening. He was accompanied by 2 constables and carried with him the kind of professional gravity that suggested he recognized the significance of what was about to transpire. Miss Marple had prepared a detailed written account of her observations and conclusions, which she presented to him in the study, along with a summary of the confessions that both Peter Weatherby and Patricia Ashford had made to her during their private conversations. The inspector read through this material with the kind of methodical attention that characterized his approach to criminal investigation, occasionally pausing to ask clarifying questions or to request elaboration on particular points. When Inspector Blackwood had finished reading Miss Marple's account, he looked up at her with an expression that mingled respect and a certain degree of chagrin at having initially dismissed Eleanor's death as a simple accident. He acknowledged that her observations had identified patterns and connections that his initial investigation had failed to uncover, and he expressed his appreciation for her willingness to continue examining the circumstances of Eleanor's death even after the official inquiry had seemingly concluded. He then proceeded to conduct formal interviews with both Peter Weatherby and Patricia Ashford, confronting them with the evidence that Miss Marple had gathered and with the admissions that they had made to her during their private conversations. Peter Weatherby initially attempted to recant his confession to Miss Marple, claiming that he had been confused and distressed during their meeting, and that his statements should not be interpreted as genuine admissions of guilt. However, when confronted with Sutton's detailed account of Peter's instructions regarding the arrangement of the candelabra's supports, and when the inspector explained that the physical evidence seemed to corroborate the narrative that Miss Marple had constructed, Peter's resistance began to crumble. Under the weight of this evidence and the clear indication that the inspector possessed sufficient grounds to charge him with murder, Peter eventually provided a formal confession that essentially corroborated the account he had given to Miss Marple, though with somewhat greater emphasis on the accidental nature of Eleanor's death and considerably less acknowledgement of his premeditated intent to ensure that death. Patricia Ashford's response to Inspector Blackwood's questioning was somewhat different in character. She maintained throughout the initial interviews that she had provided Peter with information regarding Eleanor's movements without understanding that he intended to use this information to harm Eleanor. She suggested that Peter had deceived her regarding his intentions, and that she bore no responsibility for his actions beyond having been unfortunately manipulated by a man whom she had believed to be trustworthy. However, when the inspector produced evidence of conversations between Patricia and Peter in which they had discussed Eleanor's proposed modifications to her will and the financial implications of these modifications for both of them, Patricia's defense began to appear increasingly implausible. Eventually, faced with the accumulation of evidence and the clear indication that the inspector was prepared to charge her with conspiracy to commit murder, Patricia acknowledged that she had suspected Peter's intentions and had chosen not to investigate them more closely, thereby effectively participating in the conspiracy through her deliberate avoidance of knowledge that might have required her to report his plans to the authorities. The arrest of Peter Weatherby and Patricia Ashford sent shockwaves through the village of Lilycroft below and beyond. The newspapers, which had initially carried brief notices regarding Eleanor's death and the apparent accident that had caused it, now devoted considerable space to the revelation that a murder had been committed within the household of one of the village's most prominent families. The account of how an elderly woman of no official standing had unraveled the conspiracy and brought the perpetrators to justice proved to be particularly fascinating to editors and readers alike, and within days, Miss Marple found herself the subject of considerable media attention. She bore this attention with a kind of equanimity that suggested she found the entire affair somewhat distasteful, though she acknowledged that the publicity might serve a useful purpose in demonstrating the importance of careful observation and logical thinking in criminal investigation. Colonel Jasper Weatherby was devastated by his son's arrest, experiencing a kind of profound shame that seemed to age him considerably during the weeks following the revelation of Peter's crime. He resigned his position in the village social hierarchy and withdrew from public life, though he maintained his residence in the old rectory and continued to receive visitors who wished to express their sympathy for the misfortune that had befallen his family. Margaret Weatherby, his wife, seemed to experience a kind of emotional collapse in response to her son's actions, requiring the ministration of Dr. Hale and spending considerable ODs of time in a state of quiet withdrawal from social engagement. The financial difficulties that had motivated Colonel Weatherby to hope for Eleanor's assistance were ultimately resolved through the intervention of James Ashford, who recognized that his father's embarrassment regarding his debts had contributed to the circumstances that had led to Eleanor's death, and who therefore felt a degree of responsibility for ameliorating the colonel's situation. James Ashford himself experienced a complex mixture of emotions regarding the revelation that his wife had been complicit in his mother's death. He initially expressed shock and betrayal, suggesting that Patricia had deceived him regarding her knowledge of Peter's intentions. However, as the implications of Patricia's actions became clearer, James's response evolved into something more complicated, encompassing elements of shame regarding his own financial circumstances and the role that these circumstances had played in creating the conditions that had motivated his wife's participation in the conspiracy. He engaged the services of the most skilled legal counsel available, though he seemed to harbor few illusions regarding the likelihood that Patricia might avoid serious legal consequences for her actions. The marriage, which had been characterized by tension even before Eleanor's death, effectively dissolved following Patricia's arrest, though the formal legal proceedings associated with divorce remained incomplete at the time of her trial. Dr. Hale and Catherine experienced a kind of vindication in the aftermath of Eleanor's death, being revealed as murder rather than accident. Eleanor's proposed modifications to her will had established Catherine as a beneficiary of considerable financial resources, and the doctor's social standing in the village seemed to increase as it became clear that Eleanor had intended. To enhance Catherine's inheritance, Catherine's relationship with Peter Weatherby effectively terminated upon his arrest, though she expressed a degree of sympathy for the circumstances that had motivated his actions, even as she acknowledged the gravity of his crime. Peter's arrest seemed to remove an obstacle that had been preventing Catherine from developing other romantic relationships, and within a year of the resolution of the criminal proceedings, Catherine would become engaged to a young solicitor from the county town who had no connection to the events surrounding Eleanor's death. Violet Ashford Pierce's position at Lilycroft Hall became increasingly uncomfortable following the revelation of Patricia's complicity in Eleanor's death. She had provided valuable information to Miss Marple regarding the movements and activities of various household members, information that had contributed to the investigation's success, but that also marked her as someone who was willing to participate in the kind of careful observation that had exposed the conspiracy. The other members of the household seemed to view her with a degree of suspicion, as though her willingness to observe and report on the activities of others suggested that she might not be entirely trustworthy regarding her own behavior and intentions. She eventually decided to relocate to a smaller residence in Bath, where she could live more independently and with greater separation from the household dynamics that had become increasingly fraught following Eleanor's death. The trial of Peter Weatherby and Patricia Ashford took place in the County Assizes Court during the winter following Eleanor's death, drawing considerable public attention and filling the courtroom to capacity throughout the proceedings. The prosecution's case was built substantially upon the evidence that Miss Marple had gathered, supplemented by the technical testimony of experts regarding the arrangement of the candelabra's supports and the manner in which they had been deliberately weakened to ensure the fixture's collapse. The physical evidence, which had been re-examined following Miss Marple's observations, now seemed to corroborate her conclusions with a clarity that had not been apparent during the initial investigation. The fraying of the rope was presented as evidence of deliberate intervention, and expert testimony established that the pattern of deterioration was inconsistent with natural aging or simple neglect. Peter Weatherby's defense counsel attempted to argue that their client had not intended Eleanor's death, but had merely sought to frighten her into abandoning her proposed modifications to her will. They suggested that the candelabra's fall had been an accident, and that while Peter's actions in weakening the supports might constitute recklessness, they did not constitute murder in the legal sense. The defense presented testimony regarding Peter's character and his family circumstances, attempting to establish that he was a young man of fundamentally good intentions who had been driven to questionable actions by Eleanor's unreasonable attempt to control his life and marriage prospects. They argued that many young men in similar circumstances might have been tempted to engage in similar actions, and that Peter's crime represented a regrettable but understandable response to a situation of considerable personal distress. However, the prosecution's rebuttal effectively dismantled this defense through careful examination of the premeditation that Peter's actions had required. The prosecutor established that Peter had spent considerable time planning the arrangement of the candelabra's supports, that he had acquired technical knowledge regarding the manner in which such fixtures were secured, and that he had deliberately orchestrated the timing of Eleanor's death to coincide with a moment when she would be positioned directly beneath the falling candelabra. This level of planning and deliberation seemed inconsistent with the notion that Peter had merely sought to frighten Eleanor, and the prosecution successfully argued that Peter's actions constituted murder with premeditation, satisfying the legal criteria for the highest charge that could be brought against him. Patricia Ashford's defense presented a somewhat different strategy, focusing on her claim that she had not actively participated in the arrangement of the candelabra's supports, and that she had deliberately avoided acquiring detailed knowledge of Peter's specific plans. Her counsel argued that providing someone with information regarding another person's movements, without knowing with certainty how that information would be used, could not constitute conspiracy to commit murder in the legal sense. They suggested that Patricia had been herself deceived by Peter regarding his intentions, and that she bore no legal responsibility for his actions beyond having failed to report suspicious behavior to the authorities, a failure that was morally regrettable but not necessarily a crime in itself. The prosecution's response to this defense was equally effective, though it required careful legal argument regarding the nature of conspiracy and the degree to which Patricia's actions constituted knowing participation in a criminal conspiracy. The prosecutor established that Patricia had understood Eleanor's proposed modifications to her will would disadvantage her financially, that she had specifically discussed these modifications with Peter in terms that suggested shared concern regarding their implications, and that she had provided Peter with precise information regarding Eleanor's likely movements during the birthday party. This combination of circumstances, the prosecution argued, established that Patricia had known Peter intended to harm Eleanor, even if she had deliberately avoided learning the specific mechanics through which he planned to accomplish this harm. The prosecutor suggested that Patricia's deliberate ignorance regarding the details of Peter's plan did not relieve her of legal responsibility for her role in facilitating the crime. The judge's instructions to the jury emphasized the legal principles governing conspiracy and premeditated murder, and the jury's deliberation lasted only slightly more than 4 hours before they returned with verdicts of guilty on all charges for both Peter Weatherby and Patricia Ashford. Peter was sentenced to death by hanging, a sentence that Colonel Weatherby's intervention with various legal authorities and prominent citizens failed to overturn, though the sentence was eventually commuted to life imprisonment following appeals that extended over several years. Patricia was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and received a sentence of 15 years imprisonment, a verdict that seemed to satisfy neither those who believed she had been inadequately punished nor those who believed she had been unfairly blamed for Peter's crimes. In the immediate aftermath of the trial, Miss Marple received numerous letters from various parties expressing their appreciation for her role in ensuring that justice had been served. The chief constable of the county wrote to commend her observations and her willingness to continue investigating after the official inquiry had concluded. Various members of the Ashford family sent letters expressing their gratitude, though some of these communications seemed tinged with a degree of awkwardness regarding the fact that the family's criminality had been exposed through the agency of a distant, elderly relation. The newspapers continued to carry occasional articles regarding Miss Marple's role in the investigation, often describing her as an amateur detective of remarkable capability whose keen observations had remedied the failings of the professional investigation. Miss Marple accepted this recognition with a kind of modest demeanor that suggested she found the entire matter somewhat exaggerated. She explained to those who inquired regarding her methods that she had simply observed human behavior with the kind of careful attention that came naturally to anyone who had lived as long as she had, in a small village where the repetition of human folly and error provided endless opportunity for education in the patterns of criminal behavior. She noted that most crimes, in her experience, were motivated by relatively straightforward desires: money, revenge, sexual jealousy, or the desire to maintain one's social position, and that once one understood these basic motivations, the question of who had committed a particular crime became considerably easier to answer through careful observation of who had both motive and opportunity. As Christmas approached, Miss Marple found herself preparing to return to her own home at St. Mary Mead, leaving Lilycroft Hall to the management of James Ashford and his newly constituted household. She had spent nearly 3 months at the great house, and while she had found the investigation into Eleanor's death to be of considerable interest, she nonetheless looked forward to returning to the familiar rhythms of her own village and her own quiet routines. James invited her to remain as a permanent guest, expressing his gratitude for her role in exposing the truth regarding his mother's death and her assistance in bringing the guilty parties to justice. However, Miss Marple politely declined this invitation, explaining that she found herself most content in her own surroundings, where the particular combination of familiar faces and established routines provided a kind of security and peace that she valued above considerations of greater luxury or social prominence. On a cold grey morning in late December, Miss Marple sat in the railway carriage that would carry her back to St. Mary Mead, watching the Cotswolds landscape pass with a kind of detached observation that had become habitual to her over the decades. The compartment was largely empty, save for an elderly gentleman absorbed in his newspaper and a young mother with a small child who had eventually fallen asleep against the window. Miss Marple occupied herself with her knitting, though her needles moved with a somewhat slower rhythm than usual, as though the exertions of the previous months had fatigued her more significantly than she had acknowledged. Her pale blue eyes, however, retained their characteristic quality of quiet intelligence, and there was about her an air of profound contentment that suggested a mind at peace with the conclusions it had reached. The investigation into Eleanor Ashford's death had provided Miss Marple with considerable satisfaction, not because she took pleasure in the exposure of crime or the suffering of those who had committed it, but because it had confirmed her long-held conviction that careful observation of human behavior provided a more reliable path to truth than the mechanical procedures that official investigations often relied upon. She had watched Peter Weatherby and Patricia Ashford construct their conspiracy with the kind of deliberation that suggested they believed themselves to be operating beyond the scrutiny of anyone sufficiently intelligent to perceive their activities. They had failed to account for the possibility that an elderly woman of no official standing, armed with nothing but patience and the accumulated wisdom of 70 years of observing village life, might be capable of perceiving the patterns that their actions created. What had struck Miss Marple most profoundly during the entire affair was not the specifics of the crime itself, but rather the recognition that Eleanor's death had been, in many respects, preventable. Eleanor had created the conditions that had motivated her murder through her determination to use her wealth and her will as instruments of control over those around her. She had attempted to dictate Peter's marriage prospects through financial incentive and disincentive. She had sought to manipulate the younger generation's choices through the deployment of her bequest, and she had maintained a household characterized by tension and resentment rather than affection and trust. In doing so, she had created an environment in which crime became possible, in which individuals could convince themselves that the removal of Eleanor represented a justifiable response to intolerable circumstances. This observation did not excuse Peter and Patricia's actions, Miss Marple recognized, but it did contextualize them within the broader landscape of human motivation and moral failure. Peter had been a young man of limited character, capable of convincing himself that the murder of an elderly woman was justified by his desire for financial security and romantic freedom. Patricia had been a woman whose resentment at her financial diminishment had been sufficient to overcome her moral scruples regarding her participation in a conspiracy to commit murder. Both had failed to perceive that the consequences of their actions would extend far beyond the immediate satisfaction of their desires, and that they would ultimately find themselves stripped of freedom, dignity, and the possibility of building meaningful lives within society. As the train ride her southward toward her own village, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the nature of justice and the manner in which it operated within English society. The official machinery of law had eventually functioned as it was designed to function, convicting the guilty and imposing sentences that reflected society's condemnation of their actions. However, This machinery had only been set in motion because an elderly woman had recognized that appearances were deceptive and that the most obvious explanation for Eleanor's death was not necessarily the correct one. Justice, Miss Marple concluded, was often a matter of luck, the luck that the right person would observe the right details at the right moment and would possess the wisdom and courage to act upon those observations. The village of St. Mary Mead greeted Miss Marple's return with the kind of understated welcome that characterized small English communities where dramatic events were sufficiently unusual to warrant considerable discussion, but sufficiently distant to allow rapid return to the comfortable rhythms of village life. The vicar called upon her to inquire regarding her experiences at Lilycroft Hall, and she provided him with a suitably edited account that acknowledged the tragic circumstances of Eleanor's death while avoiding excessive discussion of the criminal conspiracy that had occasioned it. The Village Women's Institute invited her to present an account of her observations regarding the investigation, an invitation that Miss Marple politely declined on the grounds that such matters were perhaps too distressing to be suitable topics for public discussion among people of sensibility. Within weeks, the immediate sensationalism surrounding Eleanor's death and the trial of those responsible for it had faded from public consciousness, displaced by the ordinary preoccupations of village life and the approaching Christmas season. The newspapers moved on to other stories, other crimes, other scandals that provided temporary distraction and titillation for their readers. The members of the Ashford family gradually resumed their lives, though each carried the weight of knowledge regarding the darkness that had resided within their household, a darkness that had ultimately required an act of murder to bring to the surface. The village of Lilycroft below returned to its state of apparent tranquility, though the residents thereof could never entirely recover their previous innocence regarding the possibility of crime occurring within their own community. Miss Marple, for her part, returned to her familiar routines with a sense of completion and contentment. She resumed her position as the village's unofficial keeper of secrets and observer of human behavior, attending church services and village gatherings with the same quiet attention that had served her so well at Lilycroft Hall. She corresponded occasionally with Dr. Hale and Catherine Hale, receiving news of Catherine's engagement and subsequent marriage with the kind of satisfaction that comes from witnessing the triumph of genuine affection over the manipulations of those who would seek to control others through financial incentive. She learned through the village gossip network that James Ashford was gradually restoring Lilycroft Hall to its former grandeur, and that he had established a reputation as a conscientious landlord and reasonable master of the estate. On cold winter evenings, seated before her fireplace with her knitting, Miss Marple would occasionally reflect on the events that had occurred at Lilycroft Hall and the manner in which they had unfolded. She recognized that her involvement in the investigation had been something of an accident, a consequence of Eleanor's decision to invite her as a guest and her own natural inclination to observe the human dramas that unfolded around her. She had not set out to become an investigator of murder, nor had she sought the recognition that had come from her successful exposure of the crime. Rather, she had simply applied to the circumstances of Eleanor's death the same careful observation and logical thinking that she had employed throughout her life in understanding the complexities of human behavior. The case of Eleanor Ashford's death represented in many respects a culmination of Miss Marple's understanding of the relationship between appearance and reality, between the surface tranquility of English village life and the darker emotions and desires that often lurked beneath that surface. It had confirmed her conviction that human nature was fundamentally consistent across all social classes and circumstances, that the same patterns of motivation and behavior that manifested themselves in St. Mary Mead would manifest themselves with equal regularity in great houses like Lilycroft Hall. The crime had not been committed by criminals in the conventional sense, but rather by ordinary people whose circumstances and desires had driven them to extraordinary actions. As the months passed and the immediate impact of the Lilycroft Hall affair gradually receded into memory, Miss Marple found herself gradually returning to the comfortable obscurity that had characterized her life before her involvement in Eleanor's death. The newspapers stopped calling, The letters of recognition gradually ceased, and the village resumed its normal functioning, punctuated only by the ordinary triumphs and tragedies that constituted the substance of small-town existence. And it was in this return to obscurity, Miss Marple reflected, that one discovered the true nature of justice and truth. Not in the sensation and publicity that accompanied their EXP, Osher, but in the quiet satisfaction of knowing that one had perceived reality clearly and had acted upon that perception with integrity and courage. She continued her knitting, her needles clicking with the familiar rhythm that had accompanied her through decades of village life, and she awaited whatever future cases or observations might come her way. For Miss Marple had learned long ago that the world was endlessly full of mysteries, that human nature provided an inexhaustible source of fascination and complexity, and that an observant mind armed with patience and wisdom could always find productive employment in understanding the intricate patterns of human behavior. The case of Eleanor Ashford's death had been resolved, justice had been served, and life in the villages of England had returned to its comfortable rhythms. And yet Miss Marple knew that this peace was temporary, that somewhere in the ordinary routines of everyday existence, the seeds of future crimes were already germinating, waiting only for the right circumstances to bring them to fruition. Until that time came, however, she would sit in her familiar chair with her knitting, observing the world around her with the quiet attention of a woman who had learned that the most profound truths about human nature were often revealed in the most ordinary circumstances.